The snow fell that morning as if the sky itself had grown weary of holding its breath. Soft, slow, deliberate flakes drifted through the pale winter light, settling over Frosthaven like a shroud meant for a town that loved its whispers more than its truth. I remember the way the cold clung to the wooden storefronts and how each step on the frozen dirt road sounded like a quiet verdict being pressed into the earth. And walking through that hushed street was Elara Wynn, coat pulled tight, hair dusted white, eyes steady but soft, as if she had already learned the cost of being noticed. She was carrying nothing but a small burlap pouch when Maeve Trundle burst out of the general store behind her, breath fogging in sharp bursts, hand raised high with a silver heirloom glinting between her fingers. Her voice cracked like a whip across the square, slicing through the stillness. People turned, boots crunching, scarves pulled down to better see the spectacle. Elara stopped mid-step, shoulders stiffening, but she didn't turn around. Maeve shouted that the clasp had been stolen, that she'd caught Elara with it. No one asked how or why, or whether Maeve's story held even a drop of sense. Frosthaven never needed proof, only a voice loud enough to drown out its own conscience. Marshal Gideon Rook emerged from behind the saloon, heavy coat swinging at his sides, jaw clenched with the authority he liked too much. He didn't ask Elara a question. He didn't offer her space to speak. He simply stepped beside her, hand hovering near her arm, not quite grabbing, but close enough that shame did the work for him. The people of Frosthaven stared as if her silence were confirmation of guilt, and still she didn't try to explain. A flush climbed her neck, spreading up to her cheeks, but her eyes remained clear and broken, but tired. Her refusal to defend herself only made the town more certain someone else watched. Colt Harrow, standing beside his horse near the well. Snow gathered on his hat brim and shoulders like frost on an old pine. He didn't step forward or challenge the marshal, but his gaze followed Elara with a depth that felt as cold and sharp as the wind. When the marshal marched her a few paces and released her with a pointed warning, Elara stumbled just slightly. Something slipped from her coat pocket and landed in the snow-faded blue scarf, edges frayed. Colt crossed the road with slow, steady steps, lifted the scarf without a word, and held it out to her. She hesitated, looking at his gloved hand as if it were a kindness she wasn't sure she was allowed to accept. When she finally reached out, their fingers touched briefly a brush of warmth in the bitter morning. She nodded once, grateful but still silent, and walked away. By midday, Frosthaven was alive with rumors. Folks leaned over fences and porch rails, their voices lowering only when Elara passed by. Some shook their heads with performative sorrow. Others smirked with cruel satisfaction. It is a strange thing how winter quiet amplifies certain sounds. The softest lie can echo louder than any truth. Elara moved through the murmurs like someone accustomed to walking through storms. She took refuge near the abandoned east stables, a hollowed-out frame with broken beams and a roof that let snow slip through in thin streams of silver. She gathered straw into a makeshift bed, tucked her hands under her arms for warmth, and closed her eyes against the bitter draft. Still, she didn't let despair claim her. She rose each morning before dawn, offering help wherever help was needed. When Clara June dropped a sack of flour outside her bakery, Elara hurried over and lifted it for her without asking for a thing in return. Clara thanked her softly, squeezing her arm in a gesture that held more warmth than the winter sun. Later that day, Elara found a stray hound shivering under a wagon. She knelt beside it, whispering soothing sounds, and tore a piece of bread from the small ration Clara had given her. She fed the dog, stroked its matted fur, and when it leaned its weight against her knee, she closed her eyes as if the small moment was enough to stitch a new seam in her fraying hope. Colt saw more than he spoke. He noticed her walking the long road to the outskirts, shoulders hunched against the wind, steps slow but steady. Something in the sight tugged at him, an echo of a younger version of himself. standing alone while the world judged with careless certainty. Years ago, he had been accused of burning down a neighbor's shed, and it had taken months to clear his name. Long after the truth came out, the shame stayed lodged inside him like a splinter beneath the skin. So when he watched Elara battle her own quiet humiliation, he felt the sting as if it were happening again to him. One late evening, long after the town's lanterns had dimmed, Colt stepped outside to check the horses and saw a small figure curled near the edge of his ranch fence. Snow had already begun to gather around her on her sleeves, her hair, her boots half buried in frost. Elara lay motionless, breath shallow, too exhausted to continue the walk back to the stables she'd been hiding in. For a moment, Colt stood still, heart catching in his chest like it had snagged on something fragile. Then he moved quickly, but gently lifting her from the ground as if she weighed no more than a winter shadow. Her head rested against his shoulder, her fingers cold and stiff. He carried her inside without a word, pushing the door open with his boot, the firelight spilling across her pale face. Inside, the room warmed around her, the flames crackling with the soft, steady confidence of a hearth that had been waiting to be useful. Colt laid her carefully on the worn settee near the fire, his movements deliberate, respectful. He removed her snow-soaked gloves and set them by the stove to dry. Steam rose from the pot on the stove, carrying the scent of herbs and broth he'd prepared earlier for himself. He hesitated only a moment before ladling some into a bowl and placing it within reach for when she woke. Outside, the wind pushed against the cabin walls, whispering in long, mournful sighs. Inside, Elara's breathing slowed to something softer, more peaceful. Colt watched her for a moment longer, the firelight catching in his eyes. Something unfamiliar stirred in his chestnut, quite protectiveness, not yet affection, but the early shape of something that mattered. He stepped back, allowing her space, but he did not leave the room. Instead, he sat in the rocking chair across from her, listening to the storm build, knowing that by morning everything would change. The night ended not with a question or an answer, not with an explanation or apology, but with the simple truth that two wounded souls had, by chance or fate, found themselves under the same roof. And though neither of them knew what awaited them beyond the storm, the fire between them, quiet, steady, patient, had already begun to thaw what winter had tried so hard to freeze. Elara woke to the soft, rhythmic crackle of firewood, each pop unfurling into the cabin like a gentle reminder that warmth still had a place in her world. She blinked slowly, letting the glow seep into her senses. The quilt wrapped around her held the faint scent of cedar and smoke. And for a moment she lay perfectly still, as if afraid that moving might break whatever fragile mercy she had stumbled into. Colt sat nearby, elbows on his knees, hands clasped loosely. He wasn't watching her. He was simply existing in the same quiet space, offering presence without pressure. When she shifted, he lifted his gaze, and a subtle nod passed between them like a small bridge finally forming. He handed her a wooden cup of broth, its surface swirling with steam. She accepted it with trembling fingers, whispering her thanks. The words felt strange in her mouth, as though she had spoken too little in recent days. Colt didn't press her for explanations or apologies. He simply said she'd been too cold to leave outside, and that the storm would have made sure she never rose again. She stared into the broth, the flickering fire reflected in its surface, and confessed in a low, wavering voice that she hadn't meant to be trouble. She had only been trying to return Maeve's heirloom after fixing the broken clasp, but Maeve had seen her holding it at the wrong moment, and the town needed someone to blame. Colt didn't interrupt. He let her speak until the silence began to settle again, then told her, gently, that he believed her. There was no flourish in his tone, no grand gesture. Just a simple truth delivered with the steadiness of someone who knew the weight of a false accusation. His belief loosened something inside her. She didn't realize she'd been holding her jaw unclenched. Her shoulders lowered, and for the first time in weeks, her eyes reflected something other than fear. When the storm eased, he stepped outside to check on the horses, leaving her by the fire. She rose slowly, moving around the cabin with a kind of reverence, taking in the modest furnishings and the scent of worn leather. Before long, she noticed something else, a few items missing from shelves and drawers. It wasn't enough to suggest carelessness. It felt like absent small tools, bits of tack, dried goods. She tucked the observation away, unsure whether to mention it, but Colt had noticed too. Tracks near the barn caught his attention through the thinning snow boot prints he recognized. Patterns in the stride that struck him with unwelcome familiarity. His breath clouded as he followed the trail, tension coiling through him with every step. He didn't tell Elara any of this when he returned. Instead, he simply said she was welcome to stay until the storm fully passed. Her grateful nod met his unspoken concern, and for a moment both found solace in the quiet understanding between them. Later that day, as the sun struggled behind a veil of winter clouds, Colt saddled his horse and told Elara he'd return shortly. He didn't explain where he was going, but his tone carried the weight of someone confronting an old wound. She watched him disappear into the frosted landscape, hands clasped together to keep them from trembling. Something told her that whatever he sought would shape everything that followed. Colt found his brother in the old barn near the ridge, Silas Harrow, rail-thin, jittery, clutching a cracked lantern that barely held a flame. The shadows on his face were long and sharp, carved by guilt and desperation. When Colt stepped inside, Silas flinched, then tried to straighten as if dignity could disguise the truth. But the stolen items scattered around him told their own story, and the silver heirloom lying near his boot shone like a confession. Silas tried to explain, voice shaking. He said he'd only taken what he needed, that he never meant to let the blame fall on some innocent girl. But envy had twisted something inside him, and watching Colt be admired while he struggled in the shadows had made the lie easier to allow. The admission struck Colt harder than any blow. The ache wasn't anger, it was the quiet grief of recognizing that love alone hadn't been enough to steer his brother right. He told Silas it was over. He spoke softly, the way someone speaks to a wounded animal more than a criminal. Silas stepped back, panicked, pleading for another chance. But Colt's face, setched with disappointment and resolve, told him mercy wouldn't come without truth. Meanwhile, Elara felt the stirrings of unease at the ranch. She paced near the window, each gust of wind rattling the panes like a warning. The weight of her gratitude warred with the uncertainty of her place here. Just as she moved toward the fire to warm her hands, a heavy knock shook the cabin door. Marshal Rook entered before she could speak, eyes hard, breath sharp in the chilled air. He'd heard rumors of more stolen goods found near the ranch and had come to haul her in again. Elara backed away, heart thundering. But Rook advanced with the certainty of a man who never questioned his own instincts. Before he could reach her, Colt returned, Silas in tow. Snow clung to their coats, their breaths labored. Rook's eyes shifted to the younger brother and then to the items. Colt carried pieces of evidence pulled straight from Silas's hiding place. For a split second, the marshal hesitated, his assumptions cracking under the weight of irrefutable truth. Silas, frantic and cornered, tried to flee. He pushed past Colt and stumbled into the storm, dropping stolen trinkets into the snow, their metallic clinks echoing through the cold air. Rook chased after him, shouting his name as the wind swallowed his voice. Colt didn't follow. He stayed with Elara, stepping between her and the door, his presence forming a shield without ever needing to touch her. When Rook dragged Silas back moments later, the storm howling around them, he finally faced Elara with eyes that carried something uncomfortably close to regret. he didn't apologize. Men like him rarely did. But he did lower his gaze, and in Frosthaven, that was more than most could offer. Elara stood still, breath trembling, as the truth settled over her like a fresh fall of snow, quiet, clean, and long overdue. The town would talk again, but this time their words would bend toward her, not against her. Still, she felt no triumph. Only a deep, steadying relief that the weight she'd carried alone had at last been set down. In the days that followed, Colt didn't ask her to stay, but he made it easy for her to choose to. He left a wooden carving on her bedside table, a small horse. Smooth as river stone, its tiny form capturing a piece of his careful nature. She found him mending a fence later, and without a word, she joined him, her hands steadying the rails while he hammered the nails. Together, they worked through the cold morning, breaths mingling in the air, forming shapes that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Their silence grew comfortable, threaded with unspoken gratitude and something gentler, warmer, slowly awakening. As winter's grip loosened, townsfolk approached her with hesitant apologies. Clara June embraced her tightly, while Maeve offered money Elara quietly refused. Her dignity had been tested enough. She wouldn't trade it for coin. The people learned something from her grace. Though they never admitted it aloud, Colt walked beside her one evening as the sky blushed with twilight. They didn't hold hands, didn't speak promises, didn't rush toward anything that didn't need rushing. Instead, their steps aligned naturally, like two melodies finding the same rhythm after wandering alone. The quiet between them felt full now, rich with possibility. Old Tanner Briggs, watching from his porch, later said that winter had carved both of them down to their truest shapes, and that sometimes two souls meet only when the world grows cold enough for honesty to survive. He spoke it like a lesson meant for anyone willing to listen. So let this be yours. Seek truth gently, and hold your judgments loosely. Not every silence hides guilt, and not every loud voice speaks the truth. If this tale warmed you, walk beside us again in the next Wild West tale. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories meant to thaw even the coldest winter nights.